As Sandrine said, I'm here today in a kind of in-between role, which also very much matches the topic of my talk on inter- and transdisciplinarity, which is also about crossing boundaries and navigating between different spaces. But despite my new position with the city of Zurich, I will mainly talk today about my research from eawag and ETH Zurich. And I think it's important to know that I've been part of different inter- and transdisciplinary teams myself, on the one hand, so I've experienced the challenges of doing research with other disciplines, but I also had the chance to co-lead an inter- and transdisciplinary research program at eawag, so I also had kind of this angle. But then I also had the opportunity to study different inter- and transdisciplinary teams in Switzerland, so I took yet another angle, and for me, the combination of experiencing, practicing, but also theorizing about other teams was actually for me a very fruitful approach to this topic. And today I chose the title of Inter- and Transdisciplinary Research in Theory and Practice because it represents two aspects that people have very commonly talked about in the last 7 years in research, I think. And one thing is that people are confused by the different words that are around inter- and transdisciplinarity. There's cross-disciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, and then there's integration, and what is actually the purpose of doing all that. So this is something I want to address in the first part of my presentation. But then the other aspects I've heard very often is, okay, the theory is nice, but how do you actually do it in practice? So I would like to give a very concrete example from the research program at eawag that I co-led and give you some insights into an integrative method that we used for moving inter- and transdisciplinary research forward. But first of all, I would like to start with what has been the point of departure of my research on inter- and transdisciplinarity. So when we read the news, I think we are constantly reminded that we live in times of not only one, but several complex societal challenges, such as pandemics, global warming, environmental degradation, just to name a few. And I think we are all aware is that what is common to all of these challenges is that due to their complexity and the interrelatedness of social, economic, ecological aspects, these problems can neither be adequately understood nor addressed by a single disciplinary nor by a single actor's perspective. And this has led in academia to a call for two more integrative approaches, namely inter- and transdisciplinary research. So we see that funders, on the one hand, make it increasingly a prerequisite in their funding calls, and we also observe that research institutes and universities position themselves increasingly with these terms in their strategies and mission statements. However, despite these calls for more inter- and transdisciplinary research, implementing it in practice is not so straightforward, and here's why. So we live in societies that are highly differentiated, composed of different sectors, and are also characterized by high levels of specialization. So we could say that non-integration is actually a bit the default mode. And such societal sectors are, for instance, science policy, industry, and practice. So there's not necessarily a shortage of experts who can contribute to addressing complex problems, but what is lacking is a purposeful and meaningful integration of them. And by integration, I mean to engage at the interfaces, and it's the process of bringing previously unrelated perspectives together and assemble them into something new. Now, to me, the way I define inter- and transdisciplinary research, both approaches pursue integration. But while interdisciplinary research means crossing the boundaries between different disciplines in academia, transdisciplinary research then means to cross the boundaries between an interdisciplinary team and different societal sectors, such as, for instance, policy, industry, and practice. One space that has become a very promising way forward for doing these types of research are not only inter- and transdisciplinary projects, but also increasingly programs. So by programs, I mean that you have a program that works on a larger common topic, for instance, sustainable urban water management, and you try to bundle under this roof several projects that jointly would address this overarching topic. And here the promise or the ambition is to to jointly actually be able to address this overarching complex problem better in a more coherent way than a single project could do. But as you can imagine, in such programs, actually the complexity increases even further, because then you also want to integrate results across the individual projects. So while more of such programs are set up, we can also see that researchers and leaders of such programs report that they still face manifold challenges to make integration happen in practice. So they observe a discrepancy between the theory of ITD integration, so what they would like to do, and then the actual practice, so how integration processes actually turn out. And this discrepancy I was particularly interested in and was at the core of my research the last years. So I would like to quickly zoom into the concept of integration, because very often we talk about knowledge integration, so the cognitive part, but actually Paul et al. Made the case to see integration as multidimensional, so that we can distinguish at least 3 different dimensions. So the cognitive one, so the challenge of bringing different logics, concepts, terms together. I mean, this is something that we just experienced in the exercise. And I think it's the most obvious one. But we talk less about the social and the emotional dimension. So the social dimension, meaning that in an inter- and transdisciplinary team, there are different expectations that need to be kind of harmonized, or at least negotiated, but also different working routines that are actually suddenly present in a team. And even less talked about is the emotional dimension, but I was really happy that someone also brought it up in the discussion. And the emotional dimension pointing to that we need a respectful atmosphere for learning in order to be able to integrate. And since in academia we are also very much used to looking for gaps and to improve things and to criticize, sometimes creating such a space is not so easy actually. And to exemplify how difficult it can be, I brought a quote from one of our senior researchers of our team, who at the end of one of our interdisciplinary meetings realized, oh, I forgot to say something positive. Sorry for that. So I mentioned that there are a lot of challenges, and we often talk about barriers to inter- and transdisciplinary integration, but in my research, and in particular in my PhD, I wanted to look at enabling integration. So it's good to analyze the barriers, but I was also interested in how can we actually activate an enabling potential, or what would be an enabling potential to make this kind of research fruitful in the future. And there are many ways of maybe approaching that topic, but the way I did it was to distinguish at least 3 different lenses or research foci. So the first one being structures. So under what conditions do we actually try to make integration happen on a daily basis? So we can think about the team we are in, but we can also think about the incentive structure that are in place at our institute. So we can think about different levels that are the conditions within which we try to make it happen. But then, coming to the structure agency discussion also in social science, we are also agents. We can influence an inter- and transdisciplinary research process through our actions. So together with colleagues, I looked particularly in the role of leadership and what kind of integrative leadership practices have been useful for moving inter- and transdisciplinary research forward. And the third lens being means. So what can be integrative methods and tools that can help us to facilitate a dialogue and a conversation in an inter- and transdisciplinary teams. So I distinguish these different research foci, but of course they mutually influence each other. And for the sake of this presentation, I would like to focus on the third one, namely means. And this brings me to the case of the inter- and transdisciplinary research program WINGS that we conducted at eawag, and WINGS stands for Water and Sanitation Innovations for Non-Grid Solutions. And if you find this title overwhelming, then this is totally fine, because I will explain what this program will be about. But maybe you can help me to build this bridge, because this is a picture displaying the point of departure of this research program. So does anyone recognize what is displayed on this picture?
I don't know, it's a water clearance,
yeah, a water treatment plant, perfect. So this has been the starting point of the research program at eawag. So this is the centralized sewer system, and the centralized treatment plant is very common to, for instance, many countries in Europe, and for instance France, Austria, Switzerland, Germany. And it has become kind of the benchmark of sanitation. So it has been regarded also in engineering and sanitation science as a big success to provide safe sanitation. So it hasn't been questioned for quite some time, but then I think it also became apparent that this kind of solution of treating wastewater, so having this large network of pipes that collect every day all the different wastewater streams that we produce, mix them up, transporting them to a centralized treatment plant, and then releasing it back to the water bodies, that this is a huge infrastructure with high investment costs that is also not feasible in all socioeconomic contexts around the world. But even in contexts like Switzerland or Germany, where this has proved useful, given that now these kind of treatment plants need to be refurbished, which is very cost intensive, or when also new buildings or when cities expand, maybe there are other ways of dealing with wastewater. Because another downside of this kind of systems is that you have long planning horizons due to this large infrastructure. And as I said, since you mix all the different wastewater streams, it's actually also an inefficient use of resources, and there's also limited flexibility to such a big infrastructure. So different researchers at eawag initiated the WINGS program to explore new approaches to urban water management, which are not necessarily centralized, but rather decentralized, and that are able to close water cycles, to recover resources, so to see wastewater not as waste anymore, but as a resource, and then also to be able to adapt to changing boundary conditions, because we now see that with changing climate conditions and weather conditions, the availability or the lack of water is quite extreme throughout the year. So now to turn this into a more tangible picture, so this is how such a more resource-oriented and decentralized system could look like. So you could see, for instance, this is a toilet that separates urine from feces, and then you could, for instance, treat the urine and make fertilizer out of it. On such a household level, for instance, you would also collect grey water, so water that comes from the dishwasher, from the shower. You would treat it on site, and you could feed it back into the water cycle, so it's available, for instance, in times of drought for different purposes. And then, of course, rainwater harvesting, which is, I think, a concept that is, has been more common already. So this was the topic of the program, and as you can imagine, there were many different disciplines evolved. So maybe to name the main ones. So we had people from process engineering, environmental engineering, human geography, transition studies, psychology, urban planning, and then with people with expertise in inter and transdisciplinary research. And to give you maybe a clearer picture of also how this program was composed, so it was actually a co-leadership structure between my research group leader and my supervisor and myself, which was a very interesting combination also of having a senior and an early career researcher jointly leading such a program, which was beneficial, I think, in many ways. And we had then a group of junior researchers who were temporarily in the program. So this is a common problem of research programs, that especially the early career researchers fluctuate a lot. Once they finish, they leave, while the senior researchers stay more permanently. And what I think is important to know when we think about a transdisciplinary component, since it's a research program and the different projects were in different socioeconomic contexts, this transdisciplinary part rather happens on the project level than on the overall program level. Now, having this context about the research program, I'm coming back to the question of means. So for actually facilitating a conversation about getting from this current system to an alternative system, how can we actually capture all the different perspectives of the disciplines involved? And a method we used was theory of change. So who of you has already experience with theory of change? Okay, cool. That's already quite a few. So I've seen that theory of change has been used in different contexts also differently. And also in our case, we consulted the theory on theory of change, but then we also adapted it to our own context. But for everyone who doesn't know the method yet, just a quick introduction. So the formal definition of a theory of change is actually that it's a mapping of steps that you do in a team towards a desired long-term goal, so what you want to achieve together with your project, that is accompanied with a continuous reflection on how do we actually think that we can create change with other stakeholders, and why do we think that change is actually expected to happen in a particular context. So it's a method that allows you to make the implicit mental model of the people involved explicit, but to also critically interrogate the assumptions that all of us have about how change actually comes about in the real world. And the key characteristics is that it's a dialogue-based process. So of course you could develop your own theory of change for yourself, but I think the strong potential this tool has is that it allows you to have a structured dialogue about what you want to achieve together. It's an iterative process, so it's not that you meet once and then the theory of change is done. It's actually a kind of learning tool that you refine along the research process. And for this reason, it's actually a living product. It embraces non-linearity, so the idea is really to not think, well, once we have implemented A or once we talk to stakeholder B, C will happen. So it's really about actually showing the different entanglements of change processes and to embrace the complexity involved. And it makes assumptions about causal links explicit, because we all have assumptions about what we think we need to do so something happens. And very often we are not aware of them, and I think it's powerful because it makes them explicit and they guide our research process and decisions anyway. So I think it's important to bring them on the table. And a way to show or to visualize theories of change, there are different ways, but very often they are captured in flowchart diagrams, and I will show you an example of how we visualized it. And last point, very often people ask also, like, at what point in time should a theory of change be used or could be fruitful? And I would say it can be used in different stages, but very often it's already very useful to use it ex ante when you plan a research project. And I will show you why, because there are different reasons and purposes a theory of change can fulfill. So first, it can help a team to find a common vision. What is it actually that we want to achieve with our inter- and transdisciplinary research projects in very concrete terms? It then helps to jointly analyze, okay, what is the context we are operating in, and what are the different actors that need to be considered and that can influence different change process. It helps the team to create the bigger picture. So especially PhD students have reported that very often, like, they are so much into their very detailed research work, and engaging with others in such a theory of change process help them to zoom out and actually to see how their research relates to the bigger picture and bigger topics. Another purpose is to identify interdependencies. So on the way to achieving a common vision, who actually needs to collaborate with whom in what form at which point in time? And I think these kind of links and interdependencies are sometimes very fuzzy, and a theory of change can be useful for making them more tangible. It makes the implicit explicit. I mentioned that already. And then based on this mapping, and I will show you a visualization in a moment, it can help a team to jointly brainstorm and plan joint interventions and research activities. And by interventions, I mean any moment that you as a researcher intervene in a social change process. So the moment you, for instance, engage with different stakeholders in a workshop, this is a form of intervention. And then it can be useful to monitor and assess change. So along the research project, like what has happened, to what extent have our assumptions been flawed, what have we learned? So it's useful for monitoring and assessing change, but also in the end to learn from it and to trigger reflection in the team about the research process. Now, how can you develop such a theory of change? So this is a generic example how such a theory of change could look like. And the way we did it is that we first started with the definition of a, we always say visionary, but still realistic impact statement. So of course, what does realistic mean? But the idea is to have a vision that is kind of ambitious, so something should have changed, but at the same time, it should also not be wishful thinking. Yeah?
Just a very small question of understanding. Is the scope the society and some change in society, or is the scope the specific goals that we have inside of our project, something like having a report in the end, these kind of insights? Yeah,
that's a very good point. So you can decide for your purpose, do you want to have in the vision statement or in the impact statement the project, the very specific project goal, or do you actually want to formulate the overarching societal goal you are contributing to? So in our case, it was the overarching societal goal because we wanted to open up a bit and to be also more, to see what other things come up that we haven't realized or considered yet. But there are different ways of doing it. Yeah. So once you have this impact statement, is to move on to actors analysis. So one way of doing that, or the way we did, is to collect all the different actors that can influence this change process or are affected by such a change process, and then to think who of them are movers, so in a sense they are in favor of the envisioned change, who are floaters, so actors that are maybe undecided or neutral, but then also who are blockers, so which actors have a clear interest against the realization of such a vision and might have very good reasons to be against it. And once, based on this impact statement and the actors analysis, we moved into backcasting. And I think this is a very interesting exercise to start first from the long term and then to approach the current situation. So what kind of changes need to be in place first on the long term, on the medium term, and then on the short term for the vision, overall vision to be realized. And based on that, what you do then in the team is to jointly brainstorm. So if these are all the different changes that need to happen, how can we as inter and transdisciplinary team actually contribute to the changes? What is our own role in this change process? Who needs to be engaged? Who do we need to reach out to? And as I already mentioned, an important part of it is to document our own assumptions about change. So having done these different steps and having iterated a theory of change, it can look like that. And don't feel overwhelmed. It's a little bit with the posters we had before where people from other groups said, well, when I look at your poster, I don't immediately get maybe what you were doing, so you need to explain it. And I think this also applies to a theory of change. I think the process you go through as a team is actually more valuable than the end product as such. And if you are now really interested in theories of change, there is further literature on the one hand about it. We also documented our approach and how we dealt with different challenges along the way. But there are many other different authors also looking at how we can systematize, for instance, societal effects. And there are also different colleagues who have developed blog posts and templates that are kind of ready to use for your own purpose. And with this, I come to an end, and I just want to refer to a very last aspect of my recent work. And So I talked about that I want to enable integration, but since integration across disciplines and across societal sectors can be very challenging and there are tensions, as we already discussed, a very powerful mechanism of actually talking about challenges, I think, is humor. And in different workshop settings with different interdisciplinary teams, we actually flipped around the question of interest. So instead of asking how can we enable integration, we ask people how can we make sure that integration fails in our project. So what can you do as a researcher? What can you do as a project leader? What can our institute director can do? And what resulted from that was material that we then brought to a Swiss cartoonist, to Christoph Stückelberger, and he actually turned it into cartoon scenes that can now be used for free by making use of the reference for facilitating workshops, facilitating conversations. And if you are really interested in having maybe also decoration for your office, we also printed postcards, or if you want to use it as a gift. So if you're interested, please approach me, and I brought some in German and in English, and I'm happy to give them to you. Thank you so much.